The blue dress still had the tag tucked into the seam when I found it in the back of the closet, 6 weeks after Emily told me she'd worn it to a team dinner in March. My name is Gerald. I'm the kind of man who reads the fine print on everything except, apparently, his own marriage. 12 years married to Emily, no kids, a steady job I never talked about much because it never gave me anything worth talking about, and a wife who had, somewhere in the last year, started dressing for her Tuesday night work dinners like she was auditioning for something I hadn't been invited to see. I stood there holding that dress by the hanger, running my thumb over the little plastic tag still clipped under the arm, and felt something in my chest do a slow, cold drop, the kind you feel in an elevator when the cable gives just slightly before catching again. She'd said she wore it in March. It was May. The tag didn't care what she'd said. I put it back exactly where I found it, on the same hanger, facing the same direction, and closed the closet door like nothing had happened at all. That was the first time in 12 years I lied to my own wife by staying silent, and it would not be the last, though at the time I told myself I was simply being careful, not yet being someone who kept secrets of his own. If you'd asked me a year earlier to describe my marriage, I would have used the word comfortable, and I would have meant it as a compliment. Emily and I met in our mid-20s, married after 3 years of dating, and built a life that looked, from every angle I bothered to check, exactly like what people mean when they say things worked out. She had a demanding job in corporate communications, full of client dinners and after-hours networking events that I never questioned, because questioning them would have meant doubting a woman I trusted completely, and doubt had never been part of how I loved her. That trust wasn't naive exactly. It was earned, over years, the ordinary way trust gets earned, showing up, remembering things, being decent to each other on the boring Tuesdays that make up most of a marriage. I didn't think of myself as a man who ignored red flags. I thought of myself as a man who didn't look for problems that weren't there. I didn't yet understand that not looking and trusting were two very different things, and that I'd spent longer than I wanted to admit doing the first one and calling it the second. The work dinners had always been part of our rhythm, maybe once every 2 weeks, sometimes more during a big client cycle, Emily coming home a little tired, a little wine-flushed, telling me some story about a difficult account manager or a vendor who'd botched a presentation. I never minded. It was her career, and her career mattered to her, and I'd built my own quiet satisfaction around being the husband who didn't need constant attention to feel secure. Sometime around the previous fall, though, the frequency crept up, and so did something else, the effort. Emily started getting ready for these dinners the way she used to get ready for our anniversary trips. New dresses appeared in the closet with a regularity that outpaced any reasonable client dinner budget. Her makeup routine, usually a quick 5 minutes before these things, stretched into 20. I noticed. I filed it under "she's just feeling good about herself lately. That's a nice thing, not a bad thing," and went back to whatever I'd been doing. There was a Thursday in November. I remember because it was unseasonably warm, and I'd left the window cracked, when Emily came home from one of these dinners smelling like a cologne that wasn't hers and wasn't anything I owned either. When I mentioned it, casually, not even really a question, she said, without missing a beat, "Oh, it's probably just from the restaurant. That place is always heavy on the candles. Half of them smell like a men's fragrance counter." I laughed. I actually laughed because it was such a specific, confident explanation that it never occurred to me, in that moment, to wonder why a restaurant candle would smell like cologne and not like a candle. Looking back now, that was the first thread. I just didn't know yet what it was attached to. Emily's phone habits changed around the same time, in small ways I noticed and dismissed with equal speed. She started keeping it face down on the kitchen counter, which she'd never done before. She began charging it in the bathroom instead of on her nightstand, a change she explained once, unprompted, as, "The outlet in the bedroom's acting weird, I think it's loose." I checked the outlet myself a week later, out of nothing more than idle curiosity. It worked fine. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters for everything that came after. I noticed these things. I want you to understand that clearly. I wasn't oblivious in the way people picture when they imagine a betrayed spouse who never saw it coming. I saw the pieces. I just kept deciding, one at a time, that each piece on its own meant nothing, and I never once let myself add them together, because adding them together meant arriving somewhere I didn't want to go. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever noticed something was off and told yourself you were imagining it, not because you're foolish, but because the alternative was more than you were ready to hold, you already know exactly what that fall felt like for me. The blue dress, when I found it in the closet with its tag still on, was the first piece I couldn't explain away with a story of my own invention. She told me, specifically, she'd worn it to a March dinner with a difficult client from Ohio. I remembered the story because she told it well, a whole anecdote about the client spilling red wine near the hem and Emily excusing herself to the bathroom to dab it out with club soda. A detailed, textured lie, the kind that's easy to believe precisely because it comes with so much unnecessary specificity. The tag meant she'd never worn it at all. Which meant the wine story was invented, whole, out of nothing, delivered to me with the same casual confidence she used for everything else. I stood in that closet a long time, not moving, feeling something shift permanently in how I understood my own wife's voice, the realization that she could construct a small, vivid, entirely false memory and hand it to me without so much as a flicker, and I would have believed it forever if I hadn't happened to touch that tag. I didn't confront her. I told myself I needed to be sure before I said anything, which was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that some part of me was already afraid of what being sure would cost me, and delaying the confrontation felt, for a little while longer, like delaying the loss itself. I started paying closer attention after the dress, in a way that felt, at the time, almost shameful, like I was doing something wrong simply by watching my own wife more carefully. I noted which nights she said she had dinners. I noted what she wore, what time she left, what time she came home. I didn't do anything with the notes yet. I just kept them, in a small notebook I hid in my truck's glove compartment, feeling like a man conducting surveillance on his own life. The pattern, once I started looking for it, was almost embarrassingly obvious. The work dinners, clustered on Tuesdays and occasionally Thursdays. She was always home by 10, never later, a curfew so consistent it felt less like coincidence and more like a rule someone had set for her, or she had set for herself, to avoid raising exactly the kind of suspicion I was now, belatedly, raising. There was a night in January when I called her during one of these dinners, ostensibly just to ask if she wanted me to pick up milk on my way home, and I heard, in the 2 or 3 seconds before she answered, a laugh in the background that didn't sound like a restaurant, no clatter of dishes, no ambient hum of other tables, just a single male voice, low, amused, close to the phone. She answered a half-second later than usual, her own voice pitched slightly too bright. "Hey! Sorry, it's loud in here." It wasn't loud. It was quiet enough that I'd heard that laugh clearly. "I bought the milk." I said nothing. I went home and lay awake most of that night with my notebook's pattern running through my head like a piece of music I couldn't stop hearing. I didn't know it then. This is what Emily told me, much later, about a night around that same week. I told myself, driving to meet Ryan that night, that this would be the dinner where I finally said something to him about slowing down, about being more careful, because Gerald had started asking small questions that made my stomach drop every time. I remember sitting in the restaurant bathroom for almost 10 minutes before I could make myself go back out, staring at my own face in the mirror and thinking, "You have got to stop doing this," and then walking back out anyway and sliding into the booth across from him like nothing had happened. Ryan made a joke about the wine list right as my phone rang with Gerald's name on the screen, and I remember the exact sick jolt of fear that went through me hearing him laugh at the joke a half-second before I answered. I was terrified Gerald had heard it. I told myself, hanging up, that I'd been careful enough. I wasn't sure I believed it. That's what she told me, much later. I knew none of it yet, standing in my own kitchen with a gallon of milk and a silence I couldn't explain. By February, the pattern had escalated into something I could no longer file under coincidence. Emily started keeping her laptop closed even when she stepped away for 2 minutes to get water, something she'd never done in 12 years of marriage. She began deleting her text threads with a friend named Denise, a woman I'd met maybe twice, whose name came up constantly as the person Emily was getting drinks with, or venting to, always Denise, always vague, never anything I could verify. I made a decision that week that I've turned over many times since, wondering whether it was the right one. I installed a piece of tracking software on the shared family laptop we both used, technically legal since it was joint property, technically a violation of something deeper than any law, and I told myself, installing it, that I was simply gathering information, not yet deciding what I'd do with it. The first thing it surfaced, within days, was a search history for a hotel, the Baymont off Route 9, a location neither of us had any reason to visit, searched not once but 4 separate times over 6 weeks, always late in the evening, always deleted from the visible browser history but sitting there, plainly, in the software's log. I sat with that discovery for a long time before I let myself feel anything about it. The feeling, when it finally arrived, wasn't the explosion I might have expected. It was quieter and worse, a kind of grief that starts before the funeral, mourning something that technically hasn't died yet but that you already know isn't coming back. If you've ever found one piece of undeniable proof after months of half-believed explanations, you understand that the confirmation doesn't feel like relief. It feels like the ground finally, honestly, giving way. Once I had the hotel searches, I stopped pretending, even to myself, that I was simply keeping an eye on things. I was building a case, methodically, the way I imagine a person builds anything they know they'll eventually need to defend, carefully, with backups, without telling the one person it was all being built against. I extended the tracking to Emily's phone the following week, installing an app during a rare stretch when she'd left it charging in the kitchen while she showered, a decision that still sits uneasily with me, morally, even now, though I've made peace with the fact that I needed to know, and there was no honest path left to knowing that didn't involve some dishonesty of my own. It's one of the things about this whole ordeal I'm least proud of, and I don't offer it as an excuse. I offer it as the truth. I became, for a period of weeks, someone I hadn't been before, in order to finally see someone I'd apparently never fully seen at all. The messages, once I could read them, told a story with a name attached, Ryan, saved in her phone under Ryan Client, a title that made a certain grim sense once I understood what he actually was. The messages went back 8 months. Some were mundane, scheduling logistics disguised as work talk. Others were not remotely disguised as anything, declarations, jokes with an intimacy that had nothing to do with any client relationship, at least one exchange, dated 3 weeks earlier, that ended with a hotel confirmation number, and the words "can't wait, same room as last time." I want to tell you I confronted her immediately. I didn't. I sat on that information for nearly 2 weeks, gathering more, screenshots, timestamps, a photograph I obtained by following her once, parked half a block from the Baymont, watching her walk in at 6:40 on a Tuesday evening in a dress I hadn't seen her buy, and watching a man I now knew to be Ryan walk in 11 minutes later from the opposite direction. A detail so deliberately staggered it told me everything about how careful they'd both become. There was a moment during that surveillance week where I nearly called it off entirely, sitting in my car outside that hotel, camera in hand, feeling like less a wronged husband than a stranger to my own life, wondering whether documenting this in such detail was protecting me or simply prolonging a wound I could have closed faster with one honest conversation. I kept going anyway. Some part of me, the same part that had once trusted her completely, now needed the proof to be undeniable, because I understood, instinctively, that Emily would never simply admit to something she thought she could still talk her way around. I didn't know it then. This is what Emily was living through, in her own words, during that same stretch. Ryan started pushing, that spring, for us to actually talk about what we were doing, not to end it, but to make it more permanent somehow, and it terrified me in a completely different way than Gerald finding out terrified me. I remember sitting across from him at a diner, him saying something like, "You can't keep doing this halfway forever, Em," and feeling trapped between 2 lives neither of which I was willing to fully choose. I told him I needed time. I told myself the same thing I'd been telling myself for months, that I wasn't ready to blow up my marriage, that I liked my life with Gerald too, that I could somehow keep both of these things running in parallel forever if I was just careful enough. I wasn't careful enough. I think some part of me already knew that. That's what she told me, much later. I knew none of it yet, sitting in my car outside a hotel with a camera in my lap, feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. By the time I had everything assembled, the search history, the messages, the photographs, the hotel confirmation, a full accounting of 8 months I'd previously known nothing about, I understood I had a choice to make about how to use it. I could confront Emily privately, quietly, the way most people probably would, and let her craft whatever explanation she needed to survive the conversation. Or I could do something I'm not entirely proud of wanting, but wanted nonetheless. Expose the whole thing where she couldn't manage the narrative, where the people who'd know her longest and trust her most completely would see exactly what I'd seen, all at once, without her having time to soften it first. I decided on Sunday dinner at her parents' house, a standing tradition, John and Carol's home, the kind of gathering where Emily had spent 12 years performing the role of beloved daughter and devoted wife with an ease that, I now understood, had probably always been more performance than I'd given her credit for. I didn't tell her what I was planning. I want to be honest that this decision came from something less noble than justice. It came, in part, from 12 years of being the reasonable one, the calm one, the one who never made scenes, and a need, finally, to be seen making one, in the one room where it would land the hardest. Sunday dinner started exactly like every other Sunday dinner had for 12 years. John carving the roast with the same slow ceremony he always used, Carol fussing over whether I'd had enough potatoes, Emily laughing at something on her phone that I now understood, watching her more carefully than I ever had before, was very possibly a message from Ryan. I waited until the plates were mostly cleared, until the conversation had settled into its familiar lull, and then I set a folder on the table, printed photographs, message excerpts, the hotel confirmation, and slid it toward Emily without a word. She opened it, confused at first, and I watched her face change in real time, color draining, then rushing back sharp and defensive. "What is this? Gerald, what is this?" "You know what it is," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I think everyone at this table should see it too." John reached for the folder before Emily could stop him, and I watched a man who had known his daughter for 34 years absorb, in the space of maybe 90 seconds, a version of her he'd clearly never imagined. Carol's hand went to her mouth. Nobody said anything for a long moment that felt much longer than it actually was. Emily recovered first, and not in the direction I expected. "This is insane," she said, voice rising. "You've been spying on me, going through my phone like some kind of... This is a violation, Gerald. This is completely insane behavior." "Is it wrong, though?" I said. "Is anything in that folder wrong?" She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she turned toward her parents, her voice shifting into something almost pleading, almost commanding at the same time. "Dad, you can't seriously be looking at this like it's the whole story. Marriages go through things. This doesn't mean what he's making it mean." "Emily." John's voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than I'd ever heard it, and heavier for the quiet. "There's a hotel confirmation with your name on it." Something in Emily seemed to recognize, in that moment, that the room wasn't going to give her the out she was reaching for, and her composure cracked into something sharper and uglier than I'd expected. "You want to talk about who's been checked out of this marriage?" she said, turning back to me. "You've been checked out for years, Gerald, sitting there being so comfortable and so reasonable that I forgot what it felt like to actually be wanted by someone. Did you ever once ask yourself why I needed something else? No. You just assumed everything was fine because you never bothered to look. It was, I understood even in the moment, an attempt to make her choices my failing, and some old, well-worn part of me almost accepted it, almost started running through the last several years searching for the ways I might have failed her enough to deserve this. I caught myself doing it and stopped. "I'm not going to argue about whether I was attentive enough," I said. "That's not what's on the table. What's on the table is 8 months of lies." Carol had gone very still throughout most of this, and now she spoke for the first time, directly to her daughter, in a tone I'd never heard her use. How could you do this to him? In this house. At this table, every Sunday, looking all of us in the eye. Emily's face did something complicated then. Not quite remorse, more like the recognition that the audience she'd spent her whole life performing for had finally stopped applauding. The confession, when it finally came, arrived almost an hour later, once John had asked Carol to give them all a minute and Emily and I had stepped into the back sunroom, away from the table, the folder still sitting there like evidence at a trial nobody had planned to hold. You want to know how it started? She said, and something in her voice had changed. Less performance now, more exhaustion. Fine. I'll tell you. It started at a work conference in Cincinnati, back in September. Ryan was there for a partner agency, and we ended up at the same after-party, and he said something about how he could tell, just from watching me across the room, that I used to be a lot more fun before I got comfortable. I laughed it off, but it stuck with me the whole flight home, this idea that somewhere along the way I'd become someone Ryan could look at and immediately clock as comfortable, like that was a diagnosis. The first time anything actually happened was 3 weeks later, at a regional meeting, nothing physical, just a conversation that went on 2 hours longer than it needed to, and I told myself that talking wasn't cheating, that I was allowed to enjoy a conversation. By November it wasn't just conversation anymore, and I remember, the first time we were actually together, lying there afterward telling myself, this is just something for me, it doesn't take anything away from Gerald, it's not real in the way my marriage is real, and I believed that for longer than I want to admit, because believing it meant I didn't have to stop. I was scared constantly. Not scared enough to stop, just scared enough to get better at hiding it. New hotels, careful timing, deleting things immediately. There were mornings I couldn't look at our wedding photo in the hallway, so I started avoiding that hallway entirely, taking the long way to the kitchen through the garage, and it took me weeks to even notice I was doing it. Ryan wanted more than I was willing to give him these last couple months, wanted me to actually leave, actually choose, and I kept telling him I needed time, when really what I needed was for nobody to ever find out so I wouldn't have to choose anything at all. She stopped. I didn't say anything for a moment, letting the confession settle into the quiet sunroom air. That doesn't sound like remorse, I finally said. That sounds like an explanation for why you got to keep doing it as long as you did. Something flickered across her face, not quite anger, not quite shame, something caught between the two. Couples recover from this all the time, Gerald. This doesn't have to be the end of everything. I looked at her for a long moment, and understood, with a clarity that arrived calmly rather than violently, that this was the sentence that told me everything I needed to know. Not the affair itself, not even the 8 months of lies, this. The immediate pivot, the moment she felt the ground actually shifting, toward managing the consequence rather than genuinely reckoning with what she'd done. Maybe they do, I said. But recovery requires two people who both think something was actually broken. You think I overreacted by looking too closely. I think you spend 8 months building a second life and calling it nothing. Those aren't positions we recover from together. I want you to notice something I didn't fully understand myself until much later, writing this down. In that entire conversation, across everything she said, Emily never once used the word sorry without immediately following it with a reason it wasn't entirely her fault. I filed for divorce 11 days later. Emily fought it initially, not out of any expressed desire to save the marriage exactly, but with the same instinct for control I'd watched her display at her parents' table, arguing terms, arguing timelines, treating the divorce itself as one more negotiation she expected to eventually win through sheer persistence. It settled in the end, without much drama, because there wasn't much to divide and even less appetite, on my part, for prolonging any of it. John called me twice in the months that followed, both times to apologize, for his daughter, he said, and for however many years he might have missed something he should have seen. I told him he didn't owe me an apology. He said he needed to give it anyway. Carol sent a card, handwritten, short, that said simply, "You were always good to her." I'm sorry that wasn't enough for her to be good back. I keep that card in a drawer I don't open often, but I haven't thrown it away either. Ryan, as it turned out, left Emily within 2 months of the exposure, a fact I learned secondhand through a mutual acquaintance, delivered without much detail beyond the plain statement that he'd moved on to someone else. Almost immediately, I felt, hearing that, less satisfaction than I expected. Mostly I felt a kind of tired confirmation that whatever Ryan had offered Emily, it had never actually been about her specifically, and she traded 12 years of an imperfect but real marriage for something that turned out to be exactly as temporary as it looked from the outside. I think about the blue dress sometimes, still hanging, for all I know, in some closet in the apartment Emily moved into after the settlement. I think about how a single overlooked tag became the loose thread that eventually unraveled 8 months of a life I hadn't known I was living inside. I don't regret pulling it. I regret, some days, how long it took me to notice it was there to pull. I'm not angry anymore most days. I'm something quieter than that, a man who learned, later than he'd have liked, that comfort and safety aren't automatically the same thing, and that loving someone completely doesn't mean you're obligated to ignore what your own eyes keep showing you. The most telling moment in this entire account isn't the hotel confirmation or even the confession in the sunroom. It's the sentence Emily reached for the instant she felt the room turning against her. Couples recover from this all the time. That single line reveals more about her psychology than the affair itself does. It wasn't spoken as an opening toward genuine repair. It was spoken as a management tactic. A way of reframing 8 months of deliberate deception as a survivable inconvenience rather than a chosen betrayal. People who are truly reckoning with harm they've caused rarely reach first for a statistic about what couples generally do. They reach for what they, specifically, did to this one particular person. What the story reveals about Gerald's arc is less about naivety and more about the particular danger of mistaking calm for safety. His steadiness, the quality that made him easy to deceive for 8 months, was never actually the problem. The problem was a marriage where one partner's comfort had quietly become the other partner's opportunity, and neither of them had ever built in the kind of honest friction that might have surfaced the distance between them before it hardened into secrecy. Emily's own confession supports this. She didn't describe falling into the affair because Gerald failed her in any specific, nameable way. She described a slow drift toward a version of herself Ryan reflected back at her, one she found more interesting than the version she'd settled into at home, and rather than examining that drift honestly, with her husband, she outsourced the examination to someone who benefited from her staying dissatisfied. The parent's reaction matters more than it might first appear. John and Carol's shock and shame weren't performative. They represented the collapse of the exact audience Emily had spent 12 years performing devotion for. Exposing the affair at their table wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It stripped away the one venue where Emily's version of events had always gone unchallenged. The harder question the story leaves open: how many marriages quietly rot not from a single dramatic failure, but from years of one partner mistaking a lack of conflict for the presence of connection? What stays with me longest from this story is the blue dress, a single overlooked detail, a tag that shouldn't have still been there, that ended up unraveling 8 months Gerald hadn't even known were missing from his own life. I think about how much of the truth, in situations like this, is never actually hidden. It's simply sitting there, waiting for someone to stop explaining it away. Here's the quiet question worth carrying: if something in your own life doesn't add up right now, what story are you currently telling yourself to keep from looking at it directly? If someone has ever told you that what they did to you was something people recover from all the time, as if that made it smaller, I'd love to hear, in one word in the comments, who that was for you. Thank you for staying with Gerald's story to the end. It means something to have it heard by people who understand exactly what that kind of quiet unraveling costs.